Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to later in this contribution respond to some of Dr. Smith's comments, but before then I think it's salutary to reflect on the fact that this government keeps making promises that its management of the economy will deliver growth, jobs, higher income, but it's not working and it hasn't worked. They keep rolling out these same promises. It's time for New Zealand to stop talking about what National says it's going to do and start talking about what National is actually doing and what they're not achieving. Tomorrow they're going to roll out the same promises. David Shearer has already read out some of the repetitive promises that have never been kept by the Prime Minister, John Key. I'm going to make reference to some of the similar statements by the Minister of Finance, because there's so many of them, they're legion. Budget last year, the Minister of Finance promised growth is forecast to reach 4% next year, and the economy forecast to create 170,000 new jobs over the next 4 years. Was that achieved? No, that was not achieved. And that promise was made after the two major earthquakes in Christchurch and 3 years after the global financial crisis. Then he says in the pre-election fiscal update, of course this is an advanced election, they're trying to gild the lily there, he says at present export prices are high, business confidence remains firm, and the Rugby World Cup has provided temporary support for consumption and services for exports. And the Prefu had some promises as to growth in the economy and the debt track. Were those forecasts, did they come true? No, they didn't either. And then we had, in page 2 of his budget document last year, he had a heading, Achieving Higher and More Sustainable Growth. I can't believe the gall of that statement after already 3 years oversight of poor economic growth. They said they were achieving high and more sustainable growth, and instead we've had growth that turns out to be less than forecast, and over the period of their government it's been the worst in the last 50 years. Then in that same speech he said the economy has in prospect the strongest growth for a decade, another promise that isn't being kept. Then he said that the previous year's budget supported jobs and economic growth. Well, if that's why didn't we get jobs and economic growth instead of people going to Australia for jobs and insufficient economic growth here? Then he said New Zealand's growth rate is accelerating. But did it? No, it didn't. Then he said it was expected to accelerate in the second half of 2011 and through 2012. Has it? No. And then he said the underlying growth is anticipated alongside Christchurch's rebuilding, i.e. there'd be growth not just in Christchurch but elsewhere. Has there been? No. And then he says the recovery in activity is now expected from mid-2011, explaining further delays, with economic growth rising to 1.8% in the year to March 2012. Did it? No. And then he said it was going to peak at 4% in the year to March 2013. And will it? No. Mr. Speaker, this government's promises on growth are not worth the paper they are written on. The problem is that their big economic initiatives have been the Jobs Summit, which produced a cycleway, then mining and national parks that they abandoned. Then they wouldn't agree any step to close the wage gap with Australia, but had some promise that they were going to cause a step change in the economy, which has never happened. And then smarting because of criticisms that they had no plan to grow the economy, they came up with this ridiculous idea to sell off the SOEs, which increases the government deficit by $100 million per annum. And as we've often said, changing who owns what already exists does nothing to grow the economy. You don't get any more exports. The economy's not growing, Mr. Speaker. Our export sector earns too little because we're narrow-based. We haven't got enough savings. Tax incentives go to the wrong place, and tough decisions are needed on all of these issues, and National will not take any of them. So even if National limps back to surplus in 2014-15, and I think they will, we would too, Mr. Speaker, even if they do, they don't cure our fundamental problems because they haven't rebalanced the economy. We need growth in jobs, exports, growth in GDP per capita, and on these measures, National has failed.
Roa Flavel.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker, kia ora tātou katoa. I te tuatai ka tai anō kau hoki mai te wā kāinga.